Thank you, Damien, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to be the first speaker in this event. So, title of my talk is Real-Time Democracy, Imagining the City of Permanent Innovation. I'll say a bit more about what exactly I mean by those terms. But first of all, I wanted to start with a snapshot to give you an idea of real-time democracy. This snapshot is about San Francisco. So I don't know if you've been to San Francisco, but if you go there, that's the first thing you'll see getting outside the airport. So it's the mayor, Mr. Edwin Lee, welcoming you to San Francisco as the innovation capital of the world. So what does innovation capital of the world mean in this context? Well, first of all, it's a matter of dense connections between the public bodies and the tech companies. And maybe a good sign of that is the Twitter sign. Well, I mean the material Twitter sign, not the virtual one. As you may know, the Twitter headquarters moved to downtown San Francisco recently, and that was a major event for the city. Because it was a sign that San Francisco was attracting tech companies as opposed to Silicon Valley. So this is the first reason why San Francisco might be the innovation capital of the world is because of the strong collaborations between the tech sector and the public bodies. The tech sector was very supportive of the current mayor, the very one who was claiming that San Francisco was indeed the innovation capital of the world. Another reason why San Francisco might be the innovation capital of the world is the fact that innovation is indeed everywhere in the city. So this is a poster of an initiative called Living Innovation Zones, and it's an initiative originating from the city of San Francisco. And the idea, as you can see on this picture, is to turn everyone, basically, into innovators, to say that every citizen has the ability to transform the city into a place where innovation has something to contribute to the urban organization. So the idea is, for instance, to tell people that they can transform parts of the public space into new uses for charging electric vehicles, for instance, or for green spaces, that sort of thing. And so this initiative provides the tools and instruments for people to test and experiment with these ideas. So there are collaborations with the tech sector, innovation at the level on the streets, you might say. So what are the connections between these two dimensions of the innovation capital of the world? Well, these connections might be provided by a series of organizations that have been recently put in place in San Francisco. So a good example is the Mayor's Office of Civic Innovation, who is in charge of ensuring the relationships between the public bodies and private companies, startups or big tech companies, for them to contribute to urban problems that the city faces. Another important actor is a foundation. It's a private actor, but a non-profit private actor. City Innovate Foundation has also been active in San Francisco for the past years, and is also focusing on helping the public bodies being in relationships with the private sector, with startups, with companies, to solve urban problems. The SFMTA, the Municipal Transportation Agency, has been in place for a number of years, but it has recently been involved in putting together a direction for innovation with the exact same objective, to make sure that urban policy is understood as a set of separated problems for which the private sector might have answers to. So what do I want to say, starting with this snapshot in San Francisco? Well, as written here, I have one perspective to offer and two lessons. The perspective I want to discuss is this idea of real-time democracy in the city of permanent innovation. The point I want to make is that what's happening in San Francisco is a good illustration of what can be described as a city of permanent innovation, which goes with a particular political model, which I call real-time democracy. So how is public action understood in the city of permanent innovation? Well, it's understood in a very particular way. It's understood as a matter of identifying isolated problems for which solutions can be identified as well. And it is not at all neutral. I mean, it's a very particular ways of understanding urban policy, right? It's not a matter of long-term planning. It's not a matter of macro policy. It's a matter of separating isolated problems and looking for partners within the private sectors or within citizen groups to find solutions to this problem. So the picture I put on this slide is from an app that was developed using the open data program of San Francisco. San Francisco was one of the first cities, if not the first city, to launch an open data program. So this app is mapping the calls to SF311, which is non-emergency, a number you can call for non-emergency situations in the city. And this app maps the various issues that inhabitants might face in the cities, like, for instance, leaking drains, or someone shouting on the streets, or noisy neighbors, and that sort of things. This app is a very good example for what I want to say. It's a way of redefining always the particular problems that cities face and finding solutions for these problems. It's like defining in real time what the issues are, and in real time finding potential solutions. So it's another important dimension of this particular mode of political organization. It's the idea that problems and solutions are in permanent adaptations. And of course, data are a very good instrument to do that, and in particular open data, because it gives the private sector and citizen groups the possibilities to identify by themselves potential problems and potential solutions. So that's the first dimension of this city of permanent innovation, an urban policy made of the permanent adaptation of solutions to permanently identified problems. If we push one step further, then we can think of the permanent adaptation in terms of incentives. So this picture is an app that such apps exist in many cities. In San Francisco, it's called Muni Mobile. It's collect the data about public transportations and try to optimize the trajectories to go from point A to point B. The idea for some people within the San Francisco public bodies is to use apps such as these to collect data for private and public transportations, and to use these apps to work by incentives, meaning that if you want to go from point A to point B, you might have 4 different ways to go there, and maybe the second it takes more time. But the second doesn't use a subway that is crowded. So if you take the second line, then you get rewards, then you get points. And maybe after 50 or 100 points, then you earn a dinner at a restaurant, or maybe a ticket for the movies. Well, using incentives is also a way to ensure these permanent adaptations of problem and solutions, to really put in place this idea of real-time democratic participation of users, in this particular case of the transportation system. Well, I said I had one perspective and 2 lessons. The one perspective I just gave you, it's this idea of the city of permanent innovation with this associated political model real-time democracy. Well, two lessons, really. Lesson 1, there are strong connections between innovation and democracy. Conceiving the city urban policy in those terms, in the terms of permanent adaptation, is absolutely not neutral. It's a way of thinking of political representation in particular terms. This is the very same example that I was mentioning earlier about this app collecting data from SF311. And what is also interesting in this example is that it does representation in 2 senses of the term. It does representation at an epistemological term, if you will. It provides a picture about knowledge, about the knowledge of what's happening in the city. But it also does political representation. Political representation in that it gives voice to concerned citizens about particular problems. And that's a very important idea of real-time democracy. It's the idea that the representation of concerned citizens has to be done in real time, has to be adapted as problems and solutions are identified. And of course, it's a very specific way of understanding political representation. It might be at odds with other forms of political representations. For instance, representation techniques that are based on the representation of communities, interest-based representations, representation techniques that are built over long periods of time, which this idea of real-time adaptation might be at odds with. Well, the other important component linking this idea of permanent innovation with democratic ordering is the type of urban policy that it renders possible. So, what is particularly easy to conceive of in the city of permanent innovation within real-time democracy is our experiments. Because if you conceive urban policy as a matter of permanently adapting problems and solutions, then you have strong incentives to have some sort of light public interventions on the public space, like tests and experiments. So this is a picture taken on the streets of San Francisco from a program that was designed to, as I mentioned earlier, turn inhabitants into experimentators, so to speak, into innovators trying to reinvent new forms of uses for the public space. So it's particularly easy to conceive, oops, I don't know what happened there. Okay. It's particularly easy to conceive of urban policy in ways of experimentations in the city of permanent innovation. What is more difficult to think about is examples such as this one. So this is a picture also from San Francisco. This is a picture of a major development project in downtown San Francisco. It's a train station, basically. Well, actually, not just a train station, also a bus station. It's called the Transbay Transit Center. It's a gigantic project spanning for years, which goes with the redevelopment of the city. And of course, one can wonder whether in the city of permanent innovation, it's easy to think of this macro project spanning across a number of years and requiring strong investments and strong, heavy public intervention. The second lesson from this idea of real-time democracy in the city of permanent innovation is that the pervasiveness of data makes them political. And again, San Francisco is an interesting example because, as I said, data are an important component of this idea of permanent adaptation of problems and solutions. But they're not used only by the private sector and by the public bodies. They're also used by activists. And San Francisco has been a site where there has been a lot of activism against the gentrification of the city, against eviction, against the fact that the strong collaborations with the sectors have also resulted in increases in rents and consequently evictions. So you have this project called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. It originates from a group of activists, and it's also very interesting because it gathers data about rents, for instance, about evictions, about narratives of evictions. So this is an example that I took from their website, and each dot is a particular example, a particular case of eviction. So data are not just used by the public bodies, they're not just used by companies, they're also used by activists when trying to prove their point being that the current changes in San Francisco result in an increased number of eviction for, of course, targeting poor people. What is also interesting to look at is that this use of data by the activists is also not really in line with real-time democracy. For them, what is important is to build communities at the local levels and not ensuring the real-time adaptations of problem solutions, not ensuring the real-time reconfigurations of social groups, which really working with the social groups that currently exist. Well, another dimension, another reason why data are political is that they have strong economic stakes. And when considering the example I was mentioning earlier about using incentives through apps such as Muni Mobile, then it's important to consider that the collaborations between public bodies and the private sector on which it relies also has to deal with data that are sensitive, that private companies might not want to release to the public bodies. So, for instance, the SFMTA, the San Francisco Transportation Agency, has collaborated with Waze, the transportation app. But then the issue is that Waze does not necessarily want to share its data with external partners. So there are all sorts of complicated arrangements that need to be put together for the public bodies to be able to use these data. So in this particular example, collaboration with a third party, with a university that was the only one able to look at the data of, So a third party, which was the only one able to look at the data of both the private company and the public bodies. Well, I wanted to finish with some reflection about how to make data a platform for political discussion, and not just something that can be used in an instrumental way to ensure that real-time democracy is being enacted. So this is something I took from the website of the Open Data program of the city of San Francisco, and you see this linear progression between data, between research, and eventually increased quality of life and all sorts of positive outcomes. In a way, it's a good illustration of what I was describing, this idea of permanent adaptation of problems and solution. But you might ask a series of questions. So, for instance, is it possible to have a political discussions at this level? Is it possible to have some sort of political discussions at the level of research or analysis, at the level of program assessments? Is it possible to have political discussions about the long-term perspectives of the city's objectives for its policy? So, I wanted to end this talk with a reflection, starting maybe from the possible difference between real-time democracy and continuous democracy. And in a sense, I'm glad that this session is called Continuous Democracy and not Real-Time Democracy, because it provides ideas into thinking maybe more in terms of long-term reflections about how to define political priorities for cities, and not just the permanent adaptations of problems and solutions, not just the permanent reconfiguring of social groups and social organizations, but also maybe ways of thinking, potential collaborations with groups that already exist, with interest groups, with groups that try to build with local communities as they are, instead of trying to permanently redefine what the potential problems and solutions are. So I wanted to end with that thought, and trying to say also that real-time democracy is an idea that's something that's going on. It's not one city exactly, but it's more some direction of change that we might want to use as an opportunity to rethink the connection between innovation in cities and potential democratic organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laurent, for this fantastic presentation on real-time democracy. Before we open the floor to questions from the audience, I had a question for you in regards to real-time democracy and size, because most municipalities aren't the size of San Francisco or aren't located next to the Silicon Valley. So do the principles that you've enunciated in your presentation also apply for smaller cities? In other words, when it comes to real-time democracy, does size matter?
That's a very good question. Well, this is also the reason why San Francisco is particularly interesting, because it might be the place where it's the most explicit, where it's the easiest to identify this particular way of thinking. But then, if you think of real-time democracy not as a model for cities to follow, but more as a mode of reasoning, for the bodies involved, for the public bodies involved in the government of cities, then you can find this form of this mode of reasoning elsewhere. So if you think of the way of defining urban policy as a matter of permanently adapting problems and solutions, of permanently adapting who the relevant publics are, and permanently adapting, the political organizations that are supposed to contribute to decision making, then you can find this mode of reasoning elsewhere. I think what is interesting in San Francisco is that there are experiments that go in that direction. There's also explicit reflection about incentives that you might not find elsewhere in the world. So that's a particular case, but then you can find this mode of reasoning elsewhere as well.
Hi, my name is Anna Stolbröst and I'm from Luleå University of Technology in Sweden. You are talking about real-time democracy.
Yep.
How has the citizens been involved in developing these solutions?
Well, that's a good question.
Participation in that sense as well.
Well, that's a good question. The thing is, all the initiatives I was mentioning in San Francisco are conducted in the name of a dual public, so to speak. First public being the tech sector, and the second public being the inhabitants of San Francisco. And really, all these initiatives are meant to transform the inhabitants into an innovator or a contributor to all these initiatives. But it's not at all satisfactory for all the actors involved. It's not satisfactory for the activists who would say that it's not what democracy is about, and it's not satisfactory for a series of interest groups in the city who fight, for instance, against the urban development, against the construction of high-rise buildings, for instance. And we would say that this particular form of democracy is not exactly what matters. These people would say that the form of democracy that matters is the political negotiations, for instance, of city regulations about the possibility to transform the urban landscape, and not the permanent adaptation for instance, optimizing a transportation system. So it's it's a controversial area, really, what the public of this democracy is.